And Cyril Ramaphosa has met with European leaders to discuss ways to help bring peace to the Russia-Ukraine war. The talks focused on dialogue and South Africa's role in supporting international mediation amid growing concerns over the conflict's humanitarian as well as the economic impact. International relations expert, that's Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, join us now to explain whether these discussions could lead to any real progress. Kingsley, thank you so much for the time. Good morning to you. When you start seeing presidents like Emmanuel Macron, like Sir Keir Starmer, all of them pointing out and having statements that relate to having a conversation with President Cyril Ramaphosa in trying to aid peace and the progress between Russia and Ukraine, that looks like we're making some real change. Is that possible from a South African perspective?
Good morning, Arabile, and good morning to you, Imani, too. No, there has been a concerted effort, one by the Russian Federation. Each time they are about to have discussions, President Putin would phone all members of the BRICS and give them a high-level briefing about the discussion and the outcome of the discussion. This is what happened during the Alaska summit, and we've seen that pattern going on. So it appears now quite clearly that the Europeans are doing the same. They are trying to woo certain countries that they think may bring numbers, because this is a game of numbers. I don't think South Africa is involved in mediation. Mediation in that conflict, I believe, is very complex. And mediation, by its nature, it requires both disputants to accept the mediator. And the mediator has to stay neutral on issues that are causing the dispute. And the mediator cannot be neutral in terms of resolving the conflict. Remember, you get involved in the mediation because you want to bring an end to a conflict and save life. This is one conflict that South Africa has no role. South Africa cannot play that. The Europeans themselves, in terms of the mediation that is handled by the US, they are the periphery, they are not the core. So South Africa, it's no way involved. And I think this is a question of lobbying South Africa that you're starting to see. And I've already said, Arabile, that South Africa is very careful to navigate this dicey space, particularly given the transatlantic conflict that we are all seeing.
Then why did we get involved? Why are we here? I mean, we've long championed that non-alignment stance for the country, and yet we're willing to get involved in this one. We have BRICS as a partnership that Russia is in, and our involvement with Russia stems many years, in fact. And on the other hand, we're also not trying to anger the United States. How do we get ourselves right in this? Why get involved in something like this then?
Arabile, there are two approaches to the mediation. There's what is called contextual intervention and substantive intervention. Contextual intervention, it's creating conditions conducive for negotiation and to allow disputants to start negotiating. It's essentially a process where you build confidence amongst disputants. Now, the substantive intervention, you go straight to issues. Now, those two issues have been bedeviling the Russians and the Americans. The Russians have their conditions. The Ukrainians have their own conditions for the negotiations. The Ukrainian conditions are the contextual intervention. And the Russians have always have this substantive intervention. And in conflict resolution, at one stage, you can match the two approaches and create both contextual and substantive mediation. You are likely to make progress when you combine the two, because the Americans have moved away from the ceasefire. Ceasefire is regarded as a contextual intervention. They've moved away from that. They are of the view that you have to go to substantive discussion in order to resolve the conflict. The Europeans are not in favor of that. You have seen that during the White House discussions on the 18th, where actually even amongst themselves take the position taken by Macron and the position taken by Mance. They are not the same. Mance was saying the next discussion between the Russians, the Americans, or the Ukrainians must be preceded by a ceasefire. And Macron had a total different view. Starmer had a total different view. So you can see there are challenges amongst themselves. and South Africa gets involved in that, and South Africa is not even sitting around the table. So South Africa must be very careful about pronouncement. I've seen the statement by the presidency.
Yeah.
They are speaking about the next trilateral discussion. The Russians are having a total different view about the trilateral meetings. The Europeans have a different view about trilateral discussion. Macron said actually, they need, as the European, they need to sit around the table because the security architecture, the future security architecture of Europe is not only confined to Russia, Ukraine, it must include Europe in its entirety.
Yeah.
Is this space that South Africa wants to play on? There's a need for global security architecture that we must play in that space because, you know, this conflict has serious ramification beyond Europe and so on.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And one wonders then what the economic repercussions could be of something like this, because for South Africa, we, as you said, don't play that big a role in situations like this, but any ramifications, anything that comes out of this that may be negative, really would hurt us even more than we're hurt right now. How much risk of that is there, considering our relationships that we're trying to work on here?
It's a huge risk. We're going to end up being, if we are not careful as a country, we're going to end up being in the no man's land. We're going to be rejected by the Americans because they have changed their position. The Europeans are likely to change their position too as this conflict progresses. And then we as South Africa, where are we going to stand on these issues? I mean, Americans have changed their position around the question of the ceasefire, around the question of the children, without even consulting South Africa, and we've made pronouncements on these issues. So I think we've got to be very careful, and we're going to be rejected within the BRICS families. So South Africa has to navigate this space with utmost care. I don't think South Africa should remain quiet. South Africa can make intervention in total different platforms, but this is the game of numbers. We must not forget, because if you look at the roadmap, Arabil, of this process, at one stage it's going to end up in the General Assembly because there's paralysis in the Security Council. And in the General Assembly, you need numbers. And that's why you are seeing this effort by the European to start lobbying certain countries within the global south.
You speak of these other platforms that South Africa can make a noise in. Which platforms are those? Because I worry and I wonder about the credibility of South Africa in the multilateral forums, the likes of the African Union, the likes of the United Nations, and where we stand. Are those the areas where we should rather be making noise?
We should be making noise around those platforms because, Arabile, what we need to look at is the broader picture of the global security architecture. There are conflicts that are brewing up between the United States and the Russians, for instance, between Venezuela and the United States. As we're talking, the Americans are deploying their military warship. So there's a need for a global security architecture that provides some level of security assurance to smaller countries, to countries without which don't have huge resources in terms of investing in military infrastructure. We've seen a decision that has been taken by NATO now to increase 5%. It raises the security dilemma around the world. So there's a need to look at the broader picture, and the reform of the Security Council should deal with that, because the Security Council is the mandate of the Security Council, Arabile, is international peace and security. So there's a need to look at the global security architecture to provide this assurance that I'm talking about.
Kingsley, here's possibly a more difficult one. Is South Africa's foreign policy, as it stands right now, as we look at it, is it perhaps agile enough to be dealing with the major crises of the world, the fast-moving geopolitical tensions that the world sees? Or are we still in our own, let's call it, post-apartheid paradigm? Right? And so it becomes so difficult to swing between the two.
You know, the credibility that South Africa used to carry in the past, and that I think South Africa has to relook at it now, is a consolidation of the African agenda, which has been the key tenet of the South African foreign policy. At the heart of that was the resolution of conflicts in Africa. You will recall when President Ramaphosa and other AU leaders were flying to Ukraine and to Russia, people were raising concern that there's a conflict brewing in the Sudan. Very brutal conflict, and we don't see African leaders getting involved in that. Yeah. Why should we go so far? And this going far to Europe is basically the question of numbers. They're not looking at our ideas. They are having this discussion in Washington without our involvement. They are having this discussion in Alaska without our involvement. Why should we then provide these numbers that they so desperately seek? And those numbers, Arabile, as I said, are going to work for them in the General Assembly, because the General Assembly is the platform for numbers.
It really does feel like it really is. Does South Africa have any soft diplomacy in world politics at this point?
Well, you know, South Africa foreign policy should be anchored and has been anchored around soft diplomacy. We don't have the cohesive instrument of implementing, of enforcing diplomacy around the world. It's not the strength of this country. South Africa always prefers to have discussions. But you have seen the coalition of the willing. They are approaching both the hard part of diplomacy and the softer part. This coalition of the willing that was set up and is led by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. Last time in Paris, I think on the 27th of March in Paris, the British Prime Minister said they have close to 40-something countries that have signed up to this coalition of the willing. So that's where the issue is. So the softer part that they are using, we've got to be careful. The hard part that the Europeans have always been employing in terms of the Russian conflict is to employ the hammer and anvil strategy and use the question of the military that is going on between Russia and Ukraine as part of the anvil, and use the hammer of sanctions to basically decimate the Russians. The Russians are quite aware of this, but it's not in the best interest of global security to do that. There's a need to have a total different approach. If you look at the conditions that the Russians are imposing in terms of this conflict, some of them are quite difficult to understand. I don't know how they're going to come out of that if they expect to find a peaceful solution with this kind of demands, because these demands, they are not showing any flexibility for reaching some level of consensus and giving away certain issues.
Always good having a chat with you about this, and very fascinating and enlightening as well. Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it here on AM Report.